The Democrats at the time controlled the territorial government. But the southern Minnesota had been opened up. This is around 1856, 1857. Southern Minnesota, along the Minnesota River, those Indian lands had been opened up for people to come in, and all kinds of immigrants were streaming into what was then the Minnesota Territory. Those immigrants tended to be Germans and Norwegians and Swedes. They tended to be very anti-slavery. Now, the Democrats, on the other hand, were primarily in control of various cities, like St. Paul, the St. Croix area, Stillwater. Those were the original established towns, the big towns of Minnesota. So they get a bill finally through they have a, they do a head cutting, they do a, what's the word I want for they do a census, because they did one originally to show that they, when the 10 years was there, but they did another census so that they could prove to the federal government that they had sufficient people in Minnesota to qualify to be a state. And also, when you become a state, one of the first things you do is you select a certain number of people to go to the legislature, the federal legislature, and they needed to know how many federal districts, how they were going to apportion the state that they selected, and how many people they were going to get to send to the House of Representatives. So they had another census taken, and by gosh, they got the numbers. But again, a lot of these are people streaming into southern Minnesota. Now, they get the order from the permission from the federal government to hold a constitutional convention, and the Democrats, who control the territorial government, sent out a notice setting a date for an election to select delegates to the convention, and they sent it out to everybody and they call for these elections throughout the entire Minnesota territory. Now that includes areas that were in North Dakota, are now in North Dakota and South Dakota. And if you look at the original language that the federal government had passed, they were to hold an election for that area that was contemplated to be the state that they were contemplating making the state. So they shouldn't have sent it to some of these areas in North Dakota and South Dakota, but they did. And they did that for a reason, which was they expected in an area what was called then Pembina. They expected a lot of Democrat delegates. And that's why they were sending there. So they hold the election, and the Democrats get a majority of the vote. They win the vote, they say. But they lost in the number of delegates. 58 Republican delegates were selected, and only with voting certificates, and 50 Democrat delegates had voting certificates. The Democrats say that the Republicans stole some of these elections, and the Republicans are going, how can you accuse us of stealing when you've got at least 6 delegates from an area that isn't even contemplated to be part of Minnesota? The delegates are told that they are to appear on a certain date, but not told the time that the convention will convene. The date is July 13th. Now, the Republicans already feel that the Democrats are trying to take advantage of things, and there is such hostility that the Republicans start showing up early. And on the night of the 12th, July 12th, 1857, they're in a hotel in downtown St. Paul, and they find out there's a group of Democrats right next door having a meeting who are going to also be going to the convention. And so they propose a resolution that they agree to meet, that they would convene at noon the next day. And the Democrats sent back a response that says that they will, quote, meet at the usual hour for assembling parliamentary bodies in the United States, end quote. Well, the Republicans didn't know what the devil this meant. I'm not sure the Democrats knew what it meant. Apparently that time is noon. So they could easily say, yeah, we'll meet you at noon, but they didn't. They used this funny language. So the Republicans now are scared to death. They're afraid, and this had happened in other states, where at 12:01 a.m., somebody convenes a meeting, and you're not there. So what do the Republicans do? They go down to the state capitol, and many of them spent the night at the state capitol building, afraid that the Democrats were going to convene a meeting without them being there. Well, the Republicans are all there by probably 9 o'clock in the morning the next day, on the 13th, waiting for the Democrats to show up. And what they find out is that the Democrats are actually meeting in the office of the territorial secretary, but they're not coming over to the meeting. At exactly 15 minutes to noon, all of the Democrats march into the meeting. One of them immediately proceeds up to the podium. And a Republican also immediately goes up to the podium. The Democrat starts banging a gavel, calling the convention to order, and a Republican calls the convention to order and immediately calls for a motion to makes a motion to nominate a fellow Republican to be the chair of the meeting. While the Republicans are still talking about seconding that motion and moving on that motion, the Democrat recognizes a member of the Democrat at the podium, recognizes a Democrat in the audience who moves to adjourn, and they immediately take a vote. And they both move to adjourn, and all the Democrats walk back out of the meeting. Now, that is the only time in the history that the two sides are actually in the same room together. And it's hard to say that they ever actually communicated with each other. The Democrats leave, and they say, hey, look, some of the Republicans actually voted for a motion to adjourn to the next day. So the Republicans have recognized our leadership, of the convention. They've recognized that we are in control, that we have the chair, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the Republicans go, well, we did no such thing. There was a motion on the floor at the time to appoint one of our guys to be chair. Well, the Republicans continue their meeting, and the next day they again start meeting at on the 14th at 9 a.m. At about noon, the Democrats show up.